Good evening. I am Ken Jackson. I have been teaching history at Columbia for decades. And among other things, I'm head of the Herbert Lehman Center for the Study of American History. At a great city and a great university, there are literally dozens of talks and conferences every day. But this one is special, in part because Joseph Mitchell was special. And that's why so many people are interested in it. And because we have a special group of speakers tonight, I want to acknowledge the support of the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia, of the Herbert Lehman Center for American History, and of the University Seminar on the City and the University Seminars in general at Columbia, but mostly to acknowledge the hard work of Professor Lisa Keller, who is the Associate Director. And this was her idea, and she's done all the hard legwork to make it happen, and she's going to introduce the program. So would Professor Keller come up, and let's give her a thanks.
Thank you. Well, it is my pleasure to be here, and it was a very special event to organize because I am the daughter of a journalist, and I was a former journalist myself in Greece. And I'm also a historian. So it is my pleasure also as Associate Director of the Lehman Center and Chair of the Seminar in the City to have this wonderful trio with us today. It started out with a simple phone call to Tom Kunkel. I saw your new biography, and then one thing led to the other, and he said, this guy called me, and we had this great conversation. I said, really? He said, yeah, Gay Talese. I said, oh, maybe he would come and we could have a conversation. And then I said, I'm sure Steve Coll is going to be interested. I know him. I'll call him and we'll get him. And these three wonderful gentlemen agreed to do this evening. So you never know what can come out of a casual conversation. So let me introduce my three speakers, all of whom are extraordinary men in the world of writing, journalism, and everything else. Tom Kunkel, whose book, by the way, we have all the books of these three authors, which will be sold, and they would be thrilled to sign them after the event, and I think you all want their signatures. Tom Kunkel is in his 8th year as president of St. Norbert College in De Pere, Wisconsin, outside Green Bay. He's the author or editor of 6 books, including the featured book tonight, Man in Profile, Joseph Mitchell of the New Yorker. Prior to going to St. Norbert, Kunkel was dean of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland and served as president of the American Journalism Review. His previous books include Genius in Disguise, a biography of New Yorker founding editor Harold Ross, and a New York Times notable book, Enormous Prayers, A Journey into the Priesthood, and in 2000, Letters from the Editor, an analysis of Harold Ross's letters, and that was another New York Times notable books. As a journalist, Tom worked for the Miami Herald, the New York Times, San Jose Mercury News, and many other publications, and at the age of 29 became the youngest top editor in Knight Ridder newspapers, when we had newspapers. Gay Talese was a figure from my childhood, I should say, when my father said, if you want to learn about journalism, read Gay Talese. And I did, and I was just chatting with him before saying, I read your material in Esquire when I was a really young kid, and it was really impressive, and I said, that's what my father told me to read. Born in Ocean City, New Jersey, he was a newspaper man from the start, working as a schoolboy correspondent for his town weekly. He attended the University of Alabama and worked for the Birmingham Post-Herald, which was a Scripps Howard daily, and he joined the New York Times after graduation in 1953 as a copy boy. After 2 years in the Army as a tank officer, he rejoined the Times as sports feature writer. In 1958, he joined the Times news staff and wrote 30 pieces for Time magazine, and then left in 1965 for Esquire, where I began to read his things in 1965. He wrote pieces on Sinatra, DiMaggio, Clifton Daniel, and then, of course, led to this blockbuster book, The Kingdom and the Power, Honor Thy Father, Thy Neighbor's Wife, and Unto the Sons. He's married to Nan Talese, who is joining us this evening, who has her own notable imprint at Random House, and they have 2 daughters, Pamela, a sometimes visitor at my city seminar, and Catherine. He's currently on assignment with The New Yorker for a piece to be published entitled A Nonfiction Marriage, based on his own half-century marriage. Steve Coll, who is the head of the Dean of the Columbia Journalism School, is a staff writer at The New Yorker and an illustrious author of 7 books of nonfiction and 2-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize. He was a reporter, foreign correspondent, and senior editor at The Washington Post from 1985 to 2005. And he was the Post's first international investigative correspondent based in London. He served as managing editor of the Post between 1998 and 2004, and then joined The New Yorker, where he wrote on international politics, American politics, and national security, intelligence, and media. His prize-winning books include Ghost Wars, The Secret History of the CIA, Afghanistan and Bin Laden, and the Pulitzer Prize-winning The Bin Ladens, An Arabian Family in the American Century. His most recent book, Private Empire, ExxonMobil and American Power, is also a prize-winning book, and he won a Pulitzer for reporting on the Securities and Exchange Commission. Our 3 distinguished guests are going to have a conversation about Joseph Mitchell, who is the icon for New York history, and we will, at the end of that, open the floor for questions and comments. Keep them short, please, directed at our special guests. This will be followed by a reception and the book signing. We welcome our 3 guests and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you, Lisa, very much for organizing this. What an honor to be here with Gay. And I also want to acknowledge Bud Trillin, who's sitting up front, who we're going to pick on later to join the conversation, a friend of Joseph Mitchell's, as well as one of the great writers of his generation. Let's get right into it. I think what brings us here is this life and the body of work that so many of us have been influenced by over the years in journalism. And I think we'll start talking a little bit about Joseph Mitchell in the city of New York, and then I hope we'll talk a little bit about journalism as well, because as we'll hear, Joseph Mitchell influenced Gay Talese and other great sources of inspiration and innovation in the 1960s, and yet Tom Kunkel's biography brings us back to some basic questions about technique that we want to chew on in a serious way, I think, tonight. Tom, let's start with the biography. Like a lot of great writers, he had unlikely origins in rural North Carolina, came to the big city, was a beat reporter at the New York Herald Tribune, assigned to Harlem on his first beat, an amazing place to begin if you're coming from Tobacco Road. And he walks the streets of New York and he develops this great engagement with the city that shapes his life and his work. You probably have spent more time with his unfinished work about New York than any of the rest of us, because he struggled with a big opus toward the end of his life. What was New York to him? I mean, he was nostalgic about it, he was possessive of it, he was passionate about it, but what was the city in his mind's eye?
Well, I think when he got here, and for much of his life, New York was paradise. For Joe Mitchell. And I don't mean to sound naive, and he was certainly anything but naive. It had a lot of problems and it had a lot of issues, but you talked about his origins. I say somewhere in the book, he was born in Fairmont, North Carolina, and for those of you who've never been to Fairmont, North Carolina, which we could have a show of hands, but I think probably most of you have not. I say think Mayberry, if Mayberry had African former slaves and Native Americans and tobacco and things like that. But it was that small town, North Carolina. That's where Joe grew up, and he did go to Chapel Hill for college. But then he immediately came to New York City. And imagine going, the shock to the system and the impact to the senses, and certainly to somebody who was, had the sensory capability, the astonishing observational powers of Joe Mitchell. And he was dazzled. You're right. I mean, one of the first assignments he had was in Harlem, and he just soaked it up. And when he got off his night shift, he would still troll the place and the bars and the dives and the street front churches. And
what kind of a reporter was he? Because he was a walker in a very profound way.
Well, ironically, Stanley Walker, the legendary city editor, his first real city editor, had told him, whatever you do, walk the city, you know, don't. He said, a bus is okay, you can see things in a bus, but if you really want to learn the city, you need to walk it. And, you know, I don't know, again, no way of knowing, but it's hard to imagine anybody probably ever walked as much the length and breadth of New York City. And I don't just mean Manhattan, but I mean all the boroughs, as Joseph Mitchell. He got to know them all like the back of his hand, and he saw and he absorbed everything. And everything was interesting to him, and that's one of the reasons I think he's such a remarkable writer, because everything interested him. The things he wrote about were unlike anything else that anyone else was writing about New York, certainly at that time.
List some of his subjects for those who may not be saturated in his.
Well, in the early days, I mean, when Joe first, so he wrote for about 10 years. He sort of did a 10-year apprenticeship with the New York newspapers, originally the Herald Tribune, then the World Telegram, where he became so well known for his feature stories that he was one of the people he was on billboards as the delivery trucks went around town. So he really had developed something of a following as a newspaper writer. And then he crossed over. He started contributing to the New Yorker. He came to New York in 29. He started contributing to the New Yorker in 33. And in 1938, he started working full-time for the New Yorker. And some of his earliest stories for the New Yorker were pieces like one of my favorites was a piece about what was called a beefsteak, kind of one of the vestiges of the Tammany Hall age, where for special occasions people would get dressed up in tuxedos and evening gowns and go and just have this incredibly gluttonous event where literally steaks would come out on platters, and lamb chops and kidneys, and there were no utensils. You ate them with your hands, and you drank beer, and there were oompa bands playing, and I mean the story. I mean, you can almost smell the steak on the grill. I mean, it's so wonderful. And you know, he wrote about Lady Olga, you know, the sideshow performer, the bearded lady. He wrote about Maisie, the hard-bitten theater owner in the Bowery with the heart of gold. He wrote about characters that people would see on the streets, but no one really was writing about, and certainly no one in the New Yorker had been writing about them until Joe came along.
So, Gay, when did you first read Joseph Mitchell, and how did he influence you?
As Lisa Keller said, I graduated from the University of Alabama. I was born in New Jersey. And in my hometown of Ocean City, New Jersey, it was not the New Yorker, it was not sold. Nor did I ever see it or hear of it when I was a journalism student in Alabama. But after graduation from the University of Alabama in 1953, I got a job, as was said, as a copy boy. And that's when I discovered, because everyone in the New York Times read the New Yorker. And so I did too.
1953, you
53.
said?
Mm-hmm. And you see, at that time, I was devoted to nonfiction as a reporter, always. I never had aspirations to be a fiction writer. On the other hand, in my time as a young person, there were not many fine nonfiction writers. The fiction writers, I mean nonfiction, but the fiction writers that I most admired were in the New Yorker. They were John O'Hara for short stories. There's a story in the New Yorker by Carson McCullers called The Jockey. It influenced me very much when I was a sports writer. I wanted to do what she did in fiction and nonfiction. My first story about a jockey was stolen from Carson McCullers. Another story, though the New Yorker also had, in addition to these great fiction writers, Irwin Shaw was another one. I wanted to write nonfiction short stories, real names, real facts, no deviation from that. But I was shaped by the New Yorker short, John Cheever. All those great names in fiction, I wanted to borrow from, and I did, but incorporate their style, their storytelling technique, the monologue as well as the dialogue, into nonfiction magazine writing that's really short story informed. The only writers of nonfiction that mesmerized me was Joe Mitchell, number one, St. Clair McKelway, and A.J. Lieberman. I read everything by them. it was my pleasure to hang around with Joe Mitchell, with the labeling a little bit, because my first job when I became a reporter, as Lisa said, I was in the Army for a couple of years. I got a job first in '56 as a reporter, and Liebling was a man at the fights. And in his writings in the New Yorker, he was very personal. He was the fat man going to the fights. You know, he really was first person almost in some of those. But Liebling wasn't the writer, at least in my opinion, of Joe Mitchell. As was also said, the breadth of his interest, his extraordinary knowledgeability about all sorts of things, and being a man on foot. And that's what I really, the only experience I got from my elders, the New York Times, that I so envy my friend here, Bud Trillin, that I've known for 40 years, is he knew and worked with Mitchell. I would have loved to be in Bud's case. I would have wished I'd worked with him on the New Yorker, because I would have had the opportunity to know these people. I only know from their writing. But one time when I was a young reporter, an old reporter, must have been in his 60s, late 60s, named Peter Keyes. He's known to, I think I saw Mickey Carroll. Is Mickey Carroll in this room? No, he's not. I'm sorry, I'm getting blindsided by memory here. There was a guy in the Herald Tribune named Peter Keyes. He later on came to the New York Times. And he told me when I first started on the staff, he said, stay away from the phone. Stay away from the phone. The phone was the new technology in the 1950s, and the lazy reporters were using the phone.
Right.
He said, you have to be there. And that lesson from the great Peter Keyes, I took with me right to age 83. I stay away from the phone. I stay away from cell phones. I stay away from the technology. I don't ever own a cell phone. But Mitchell was the quintessential foot soldier of journalism, as you said. And I just read everything. And my first pieces, I mentioned once Carson McCullers' piece on jockeys. But my first magazine piece for the New York Times Magazine, I wrote some back of the book things, but my first major magazine piece in the New York Times Magazine was in 1957, stolen completely. It was about cats, stolen from Mitchell's rats. So was he covering rats? I covered cats. I wanted to. And also, my first book, which was published in 1960, is very much stolen from Mitchell as much as I could. You can't steal that much talent very easily, but I tried my best. It was a book on the sidewalks of New York called The Serendipitous Journey. It's right out of Mitchell. I mean, not out of Mitchell, but what I thought was the best I could do in the realm of Mitchell. That's about it.
Well, it's a lot. So some of his, and hey, Bud, would you mind bringing that microphone down so I can get the other Bud involved in this conversation? You can, if you could pull it off the stand, then he can just hold it. But I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask you, Gay, is I suppose in a lot of journalists' minds, especially young journalists who are reading back to this literature, this fact literature of the mid-century and through the 60s, he stands out as someone who chronicled ordinary people. In fact, at the New Yorker, they called his subjects lowlifes, which probably said a lot about the editorial environment among
High life, low
yeah,
lives.
high life, low life. Right. But this idea, this kind of conceit that an ordinary life could be made large through literary techniques and so forth. And there's a kind of picaresqueness sometimes to those choices, but he executed them with such honesty and rawness that it never felt that way in his hands. But your career, you wrote big and small. So you wrote Frank Sinatra and Joe DiMaggio, and you also wrote Bridge Builders and
a lot of what the Times called the ragpicker stories. I mean, that's I was doing those.
So what did you see in the way that he approached subjects of that scale or character, and then how did you learn to not condescend but to bring alive and to bring to scale lives that didn't have a big institutional setting or a big public setting around them?
Well, I think I see myself, I hope not in too exalted terms, as an outsider. And I do think Joseph Mitchell was an outsider.
Yeah.
This a man from the provinces coming to the big town. I very much had a sense of my own persona in those terms. The little boy in a towering city, interested in who's in the shadows with me. And so my picture of New York was always to explore those in the shadows of a towering city. And my pieces, the New York Times, unlike the Herald Tribune, of Breslin and Wolfe and Dick Chapman, my contemporaries, the New York Times did not give you the opportunity to do all that I wanted to do. It was always a fight to get stories of that consequence, of no consequence in the paper, because there's no newspaper. And one of the editors of my time, Turner Catledge, and I was very kind to him in a book I wrote, but he wasn't very kind to me when I worked for him. He'd call what I wrote with rag picker stories, you know. And it's true that I would be wandering through the streets as in the shadow of Joe Mitchell and getting, you know, maybe 50% published and the other 50% spiked. But what I did do in those days, and Bud will remember, we wrote on carbon paper. The New York Times, actually, the carbon paper was affixed to a lead page. There were like 11 pieces or 6 pieces of carbon paper. And I saved every carbon story I wrote in carbon. And when the Times threw half of them away, I didn't. And I later put a book together, Serendipitous Journey, made up 80% of rejected stories in the New York Times. And that was in the what I thought Mitchell would have liked that.
Yes, he would. Yes, he would.
That's it. Later on, I had a chance. I used to have a friend named Brendan Gill. He was a very social figure. I don't know if you know Brendan Gill. He was never home a night of the week. He was out everywhere. And I was lucky to be among his 4,000 friends in New York. And one time, do me a favor, Brendan. You think I could meet Joe Mitchell? And, oh, sure, he said. And sure enough, he did. He said, come over and have lunch at the Century with Joe Mitchell. Wow. It was like meeting Pope Francis, even more. And then when Tina Brown was the editor, I knew her. I never knew Mr. Shawn. I wish I did. I wish I could have gotten a job there, but I never was able to get in there. But Tina Brown did give me an assignment or two for the New Yorker. It started me. And she invited me to a party. I do believe it was at Radio City Music Hall. I can't imagine, but they think they put floors over the chairs, and Joe Mitchell was there. And there were photographers there, and I have in my cherished possession now a picture of me, Joe Mitchell, and the lady friend, what was her name?
Sheila
McGraw. I don't know if my wife's name was in that picture, but I don't care. That's about it.
So you asked a question to Bud earlier that I think everyone would like to hear about, which is what was he like as a colleague, as a journalist, as a friend? How did you know him?
Well,
You want to sit here for a minute?
No, I can
Then
talk.
stand up, everyone at the table.
Okay.
Yeah. There's not enough room on the stage, I'm
You
afraid.
hold on to me in case I fall. In the New Yorker, of course, the verb working with doesn't quite work because everybody was all on his own. I mean, when I worked at Time, you had to see 25 or 30 people during the week to get your job done, of colleagues. But at the New Yorker, some people didn't even come into the office. They worked at home, and there was, so I met him. I think I met him originally because the apartment building I was then living in, one of the editors at the New Yorker had the penthouse for $112, as I remember. It was that was during the World War II rent control, and I met him there, and then I had some friends who were closer to him. I was sort of like gay in awe of him. And I remember once I said, I'm really sorry I don't get to see him more. And my wife said, why don't you ask him to have lunch? And I said, I just couldn't imagine doing that. Not that he was an intimidating presence. He was always very polite. And I was interested in what Gay said about rejected pieces because Richard Harris, who later wrote marvelous pieces from Washington, had trouble getting pieces in the New Yorker for years. And he wanted to put out a book, he said, called The Rejected Works of Richard Harris, and dedicate it to William Shawn, without whom this book would be impossible. I was introduced to his writing when I was still at Time, and somebody I knew who was a receptionist at the New Yorker, and I don't remember how I met her, gave me, I think, McSorley's Wonderful Saloon or At the Bottom of the Harbor, I can't remember which one, and I was just astonished because I didn't know you could do that. The thing that always impressed me about his writing is that somehow he got the marks of writing off of it. So it just seemed to appear. It was very clear. And the other thing is, as you've heard before, he treated people straight on. There wasn't any, he wrote about people who probably weren't the most successful people in New York, but he did it without condescending to them. I remember that piece he did about the protege, Schuyler. Philippa Schuyler. And I remember when she said some comic book was the best comic book, he said, no, it was not. I mean, he argued with her on his own terms. He was always very polite. I was never willing to ask him about how he was, what his writing was doing, why he wasn't writing. And so he became, I think, known for a long time as someone who didn't write, rather than known for what he had written. And I remember when that book, he always said when people said, we want to make a collection or an anthology of your book, no, it's not quite, I need to clean up a little bit stuff and it's not quite ready. And finally, Up in the Old Hotel came out. I don't know how that happened. And we had some engagement elsewhere, but we were going to stop at Books & Co., where he was having a reading or a book signing, and just to say hello. And I was astonished. There were lines out the door, a lot of them young people, and I had always thought that his sort of posse was people like Gay and me, people nonfiction writers who really admired him. It was like a little cult, but he really, I think that book was a big success, right?
Yes.
And I would say one other thing. I was in San Francisco once on a book tour, and I was interviewed by somebody from the Chronicle or one of the papers, and it said, who's a writer you particularly admire? And I said, Joe Mitchell. It was right around the time I had found a copy of, what's that first book, Tom, that was partly from...
My Ears Are Bent.
My Ears Are Bent. I found a copy in a Seattle bookstore. That was the hardest one to find. And I took it up to the front, and the guy said, where'd you get that book? And I thought he was going to take it away from me. And I said, in that shelf over there. He said, oh, those are half price. So I think it was $1.50 or something like that. But anyway, I was on this book tour, and the interview was at lunch, and we had had a lot of wine. And the reporter said, who do you particularly admire? And I said, Joe Mitchell. And I guess I said, I'd really trade just about everything I wrote for one paragraph of Old Mr. Flood. And there was a little interior newsletter then at the New Yorker. And that interview was included from the San Francisco paper. And Joe Mitchell showed up at my office, and he said, I thought it would embarrass him, and I said, he said, I saw what you said in San Francisco, and I said, I guess I got a little carried away, a lot to drink, and he said, you're not going to take it back, are you? And I said, no, I'm not going to take it back.
Great. So Tom, that does offer a transition into the subject of his long struggle with this final manuscript that seems, in your description, to have been part memoir, part an epic sort of record of the city. And famously, he did not published for a good while as he struggled with this. But I was curious how you would describe what the it was. I mean, what was on the page? What was he writing? What was his ambition, as best you could tell?
Well, I'll answer that. First, let me just give a little bit of context because I think it's important. And most of if you're here tonight, you may know a lot of this, but you know, as Joe's career matured and he went along with the New Yorker, he sort of evolved from writing these stories about kind of quirky, idiosyncratic people, very colorful people, to more substantive stories. They still had a lot of colorful people in there, but he was writing more about cultures within the cultures of New York. So he was writing about the Mohawk Native Americans that were the bridge builders and the skyscraper builders in town, and he was writing about the rivermen, and he was writing about George Hunter, the old African American gentleman on Staten Island, and the history of that community. And as part of that, he was taking longer and longer to write. He only wrote 5 stories all through the 50s, the last in 1959, and then the last piece he wrote was not for another 5 years, and that was Joe Gould's Secret. So he was taking longer and longer anyway. And then in 1964, Joe Gould's Secret comes out, and then Joe sets about reporting. I mean, he doesn't stop and say, well, I guess this is the beginning of what's going to be a 30-year writer's block. He's working. He's trying to find out what's my next story, and he had a lot of ideas. And the overriding impulse, more specifically to your point, Steve, is that he had a ton of writers who were influences on him, and they were virtually all fiction writers, interestingly. But none more so than James Joyce, far and away. And he always thought that he would write a big story about the city in the same way that Joyce wrote about Dublin. And so as he was having trouble trying to decide what to write on, and he thought about writing about McSorley's Saloon again, and he thought about writing about this remarkable woman named Anne Honeycutt who had come to New York about the same time Joe did, and he thought about writing about a really fascinating guy named Joe Cantalupo who was sort of the mayor of the Fulton Fish Market. But none of it really got traction with him, and finally I think he just decided that if I'm going to write this big New York story, I am probably going to have to be the protagonist. And he was extremely uncomfortable with that. He never really wanted, I mean, the irony about Joe Mitchell's work is that it's virtually all autobiographical. Almost everybody he writes about is kind of a stand-in for Joe Mitchell. But he hated the idea of literally writing about himself. He was extremely uncomfortable about that. So that was a big decision when he finally decided to do that. So he did decide to try and write essentially a memoir. Mm-hmm. This was in the late 60s, early 70s. And it was interesting, if you look at his notes, every time he would go back to his home in North Carolina, which he did several times a year, he would write notes. He was re-reporting his life. You know, check out the circumference of the big oak tree, and and what was the name of the church there, and that kind of thing. And so he was really very diligent about it. He wrote 2.5 chapters that over the last several years the New Yorker published. The first chapter was this sort of wonderful omnium, my New York kind of a piece, and the second one actually went back to his childhood in the swamps and the farms of Fairmont, North Carolina. And then the third was kind of a bridge, and the third was going to start talking about how Joe suffered lifelong bouts with depression, and the city that he loved so much, it was killing him to see what was happening to New York in the late 50s, the 60s, into the 70s. He just felt like, I indicated earlier that New York was sort of paradise to him, and you live here, so you know that was anything but paradise at that time, and it was killing him. And he was going to write about that. Was sort of the transition, and then he stopped.
So I want to come around to this subject of technique and the issue of composites in some of his earlier writing, but just on that note, Gay, I mean, you and John McPhee and other sort of the great writers of your generation in nonfiction have managed to make this turn into memoir successfully at the right time of life and to figure out how to write about yourself and the world. When you listen to that struggle, what do you hear, what reflections do you have about the difficulty of making that turn?
I think nonfiction, when done very well, is very, very difficult. I said earlier, it's never been my aspiration to write fiction. And part of the reason is I was aware, even as a student in Alabama, reading Faulkner and reading some of the Southern writers I never heard of until I went from New Jersey to Alabama from 49 to 53. But the art of nonfiction means, unlike the fiction writer, you cannot use your imagination. That's number one. No room for imagination. All of it has to be learned from legwork and more, knowing your characters. In order to be a storyteller, as I aspired to be, and the great New Yorker writers were storytellers, I thought, as well. In order to be a storyteller in the realm of nonfiction, you have to be basically faithful to the facts and verifiable so people can check on you. And this is not about me, it's about Joe Mitchell, but I really want to not compare myself as a student, but I am a student. I always was a prideful student of the great nonfiction writers. But I wanted to be part of the art of nonfiction. I did think that nonfiction writers could be as much of an artist as a fiction writer, a short story writer, a novelist, a playwright. And I sort of resented growing up and later a member of Penn and coming to New York of how the fiction writer was revealed, writing the novel. I said, hell you, screw you, I don't want to write a novel. I want to write nonfiction that's as good as, or at least as good as, the best fiction writers. Well, not many people on my side, although maybe Bud and a few others, but I don't know. We never quite were treated with the reverence of the fiction writers and such. I remember one time I was with Robert Caro and we were attending a Penn meeting. It was way downtown and we share a cab coming up. And as one time we're leaving a Penn meeting, we're both on the executive board. It was Norman Mailer was the president at that time, and I think it was followed by Susan Sontag. And in this cab ride up from way downtown, Caro said, you know, I'm not going to go any more of these meetings. Why? He says, you know, we're not respected at all. Oh, it's always fiction. All these, you know, I thought, God, thank you, Bob. You opened my eyes a little bit, and I never thought about it. And he's right. It's a little bit off the point here, but the point is, nonfiction has to abide by certain rules, but if it can achieve storytelling technique, it has to be done in ways where there are no shortcuts.
Right, so we need to talk about that,
That
because that's part of what's revealed in
ahead
this
of ourselves
biography.
a little bit. I'm getting ahead, I hope.
No, you're transitioning us elegantly into the next subject, but Bud wanted to say something.
I just wanted to say on the point of, I was at a Penn meeting once when there was a discussion about a prison writing program, and someone said, this is just social work. People in prison aren't writers. And a woman who was in favor of the program stood up and said in a Middle European accent that one of the best things Penn ever did was to send these sort of care packages to writers in Europe after the war, and said, and some of them were journalists at best.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're all here together celebrating our little corner of the pantheon. But let's talk about this, because you know the book that brings us together is a biography of Joseph Mitchell, Man in Profile, that was published, I guess, just 6 weeks ago. And it's quite an elegant book, and really I highly recommend it. But it very, in a balanced, appropriate way, it reveals that some of Joseph Mitchell's most beloved work was infused with fiction. I mean, in the sense that it included composite characters, it included personal kind of, I suppose, memoir of a certain type, but not worthy of the label fact that the New Yorker put on top of it. And then, equally remarkably, you disclosed that Harold Ross, his editor, encouraged this. So it was not as if he was committing some fraud upon his employer. In fact, he was just carrying out what his editor suggested would solve a problem with a particular assignment. So in addition to that, what would you, before we turn to Gay, about the kind of how you draw a line, because we have students here, I'm sure, who are very interested in this, how you define what is an appropriate form of documentary technique that allows you to write perhaps omnisciently about people's interior perspectives and so forth. Before we turn to that question of technique, in addition to what I've said, what would you offer by way of context for, or description of what was fictional about some of his work and what was not?
I would say a couple things. One is it's really, I was a journalist for most of my career before I stumbled into higher education. And I always would tell my reporters, context is crucial. You need the context, and you need to convey the context for your readers. And that's equally important here, I think. For one thing, what we consider journalistic standards today, which are commonly accepted and we just sort of know in our bones and is taught in schools like yours and my old school at Maryland, they've been around for a long time, but they also evolved over much of the century. And when the New Yorker was started in 1925, I mean, one of the staples of the magazine was called a casual. It was this very gauzy, ephemeral sort of slice of life thing that was not even labeled because it may have been based on an actual happening. But it was also often embroidered and some fictional techniques brought into it. And that was just from the beginning. The New Yorker sort of had that kind of material in it. And also from the beginning, it was not uncommon for pieces that were being written as fact. People would interview the characters, and then they would take a number of interviews and merge them together into long monologues, hundreds and hundreds of words in a way that people don't tend to speak. And that was a convention that went on for decades, and that was something that Joe and many of the other New Yorker writers of that age practiced. Joe also, it became pretty evident that he, somebody, might talk to him, in this interview, but in the story it all appeared, the story took place in an afternoon, that kind of a thing. And he just felt like, and he didn't really have any issue with that sort of a thing, he just felt like this was, more a convenience, that the point was to, present this story for the reader, in an impactful,
that
way.
Sort of thing was going on in the New Yorker for much longer than up until the
quite a bit of time.
So.
I think the most troubling, or what people regard as the most troubling aspect of the book, I would say, is the fact that, I indicate that there were several, like one of the most famous profiles Joe Wright was about a gypsy king, a guy named Cockeye Johnny Nickenoff in 1942. I discovered in a letter that he wrote 20 years after the fact that was a composite. At the time, he wanted to write about the gypsy culture in New York, but no one individual sort of did the trick for him. And talking to Ross said, well, why don't you write it as a composite? And this had been done on a number of other occasions with a number of other writers. It's also important to remember that Mitchell, when he first came to the New Yorker, was as comfortable writing short stories as he was factual material. So all these things came together, and Mitchell says that it was Ross's impulse that caused him to do this, but that was never acknowledged. Old Mr. Flood, which Bud talked about, which was a famous profile, a series of profiles about an older gentleman in the Fulton Fish Market, he did acknowledge eventually was a composite. And there was one other instance of a character that I'm fairly sure was a composite. So everybody else, as far as I can tell, of his key stories were real people.
So, Gay, when you read those disclosures, were you surprised by them? What did you think about them?
I didn't. Tom's book was sent to me by his publisher in form of galleys, bound galley. And I read it, and when I got to what Tom is talking about now, when I got to that part, I just couldn't believe it. And I called the publicity people of Random House. I said, do you have Professor Kunkel or President his phone number? And yes, they gave it to me. I called you up, and I said, I'm so sad to read this book. I liked
You did say you liked it.
I liked it.
Just for the record.
And I said, I certainly will give you a blurb for the book. That's what the publicity people. But I'm also depressed. Tell me what you know. I mean, you did write it there, but I wanted to hear it from you because it was a shattering experience for me and maybe for others. And then I was wondering, well, what does Bud Trillin think? What is some of the... I mean, David Remnick, about whom I have great admiration, that wouldn't go in Remnick's New Yorker.
Of course.
I say, of course not. Wouldn't go in your world, in your world. But on the other hand, people close to my age, as Bud Trillin, were in the building at that time. And I remember I mentioned McKelway. Well, St. Clair McKelway, I know from my little reading, had written fiction. And he was a sort of editor under Sean, I think. Am I right? He did some
Actually,
editing?
before he was an editor
under
before
Ross.
Sean, under Ross.
And I thought, maybe we'll blame McKelway. I didn't want to blame Mitchell. Maybe that goddamn McKelway, because I read things by McKelway. I had this thing about hanging out with the FBI or something like that.
He was
Wait a minute, this
quite-
can't be real. That's why I'm blaming McKelway, okay? Thank you. No, but in answer to your question, it is, I'm so glad that you and Remnick and people your generation and people from my generation, Bud Trillin, feel strongly today that we have to, as nonfiction writers, truly not use our imaginations.
I think the reason that we have that kind of old-time religion is mostly because we grew up in newspapers where it was,
But
you
so
know,
did
where it's
Mitchell.
enforced. That's
But
what I was.
Mitchell
So, and he did it, and you did as well. So there was this ability that you built your career on to migrate the techniques and the care
Yeah.
and the documentary notes and the verifiable kind of practices
But one
into
thing-
this literary technique.
Before we get off the subject,
Yeah.
and I hope we don't for a minute more, I don't know how you do your work, and I've never even asked Bud Trillin, but one of the things that I worried about in the 1960s when I was still on the Times was the tape recorder. It was very much it being in use then in the 1950s and the 60s. And I always hated the tape recorder, and I hate it to this day. I never use it. And part of the reason is, and we're getting back to Mitchell and sort of quotations that go on and on. One of the reasons is I didn't want to hear first draft mentality from the people I'm interviewing. I didn't want the tape recorder to more or less condition me to use what's on tape, even though it's verbatim, because what was verbatim isn't very good, because people don't speak in sentences. And if they do speak in sentences, most of them aren't worth quoting. And what I wanted to do, what I have always done with regard to direct quotations, and sometimes if you read some of my magazine pieces, the quotes go on and on, but what they're doing is I sometimes will take 3 or 4 days to get a quote. I once remember interviewing a prize fighter, Floyd Patterson, once the heavyweight champion in the early 1960s, and in the piece I wrote about him, there is a long kind of Mitchell length quote. But the way that was gotten was me talking to Floyd Patterson, and I asked, what is it like to be knocked out? What is it like? And he started telling me, I always wanted to know what it's like. And he started telling me, no, Floyd, I don't understand. Let's try again. So I had to get him to talk about it. And the next day they said, Floyd, let's talk about this more. Let's talk. For 3 days, and I got about a 350-word or 4 direct quote. But that was over. I used the subject of the interview as almost a co-author of a quote. They become a co-author of the quote, and you get better quotations that way, but it's not faking. It's really out of their mouths, but it's just not accepting the tape recorder. And so many, the journalism of today, the magazine pieces of today, are ruined, I think, get off the subject, but let me just make this last speech. Ruined by the Q&A. The question and answer form of journalism is, or magazine writing. Convenient for lawyers and maybe in deference to libel action. It's good for publishers and magazines and maybe book to have it on tape and verifiably there. But I don't want that in my piece. It takes too much room and it's too awful reading. You understand?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's all. Enough of that.
Could I just make one other point? I was so fortunate in my book that I had access to a series of remarkable interviews that were conducted in 88, 89. Professor Norman Sims is with us. He's from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and he's a distinguished critic of literary journalism and has written about it. And Norm, you interviewed Joe on several occasions, and he was gracious enough to let me have the transcripts of those interviews. And so if you get my book, you'll see that there's a lot of that material in there. And Norm asked Joe a lot about these issues and where Joe was coming from. And it's a little bit glib to say that, Joe was he was more interested in truth with a capital T than factuality, although at the end of the day, that's kind of, where he was. But I just want to take the opportunity to publicly thank Norm for a very insightful, interrogatory with Joe and for the opportunity to use that material. And again, if you read the book, you'll appreciate what I mean. So Norm, thank you.
So
That worked just like we practiced it.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, well done.
Thank you.
So let's end our conversation where we sort of started, which is with the man and his work, and come back to maybe where Gay left off in talking about his technique with Floyd Patterson. It was a very powerful mini seminar. I hope our students were listening carefully. But neither of you has quite spoken the way maybe Bud did when he talked about the book he picked up in Seattle, about what you remember in your mind's eye about his work on the page, about what kinds of approaches, or as Bud said, he didn't leave marks as a writer, so they weren't flourishes, but there was a very distinctive voicing and kind of angle of attack that he took into his subject matter. So maybe I'll just ask each of you to take a quick pass at describing what you think that was.
Well, for me, there are two reasons, and I would agree. I mean, the New Yorker's had many, many wonderful writers, including some of the people in the room. I think, and Liebling certainly one of them, but a lot of people feel like, Mitchell endures in a way that maybe Liebling doesn't. I am one of the people that believes that, and for two reasons, really. One is, it's just beautiful writing. He's a beautiful, beautiful, elegant, insightful writer. It's not, it's relevant that he's Southern. To me, his sentences are sort of the nonfiction versions of, they're Faulkner-esque, long, looping, beautiful, thoughtful sentences with undercurrents within sentences and paragraphs. But the other reason they endure is because his themes are the themes of literature. The Bottom of the Harbor, a book of 6 stories, 6 of his late stories that he published, can stand with anything that's ever been written about the state of the human condition. And that really, to me, and for me, everybody who knows Joe Mitchell has their favorite Joe Mitchell story. For me, my favorite was Mr. Hunter's Grave, because in a sense it pulled together all the big themes of life and death, mortality, death and redemption, resurrection, hope, despair. And that was the story, before I ever met Joe Mitchell. When I met Joe when I did my book on Harold Ross, and he was wonderfully helpful. But I had read Mr. Hunter's Grave, was one of the first stories of his, and I just thought, this is a masterpiece, and he's a genius, and this is somebody that I need to know, and I still feel that way.
Okay.
His style, elegant, as we mentioned, but is also understated. It is, the sentences sometimes are short. If you read The Rats of New York, which I was reading tonight before I came over here, because I remember that caught my eye.
Not so much quotation in that book, in that story.
No, that's right. Well, he did interview those rats.
Yes, he did.
And the presence, I mean, the detail, the sentences, in many cases, at least in that piece, are short, but they're driving. There's a momentum in the writing, sentence by sentence. Sometimes peculiar facts are so simply stated. The imagination of Mitchell, partly, is in having his eye and his imagination on what it must be like to see a rat climbing a telephone wire, or to see a rat in the streets at 4 o'clock in the morning when you're coming home from the night shift. I mean, the description of these moving creatures and how close they are to our lives and how we are unaware of it, but in our very old apartment house, they are there, night and day. Just wait till they beat you, but you're not going to see them because they're very elusive people, and Mitchell describes that. It's powerful. Go ahead,
Could I just add one point, one coda to what Gay just said? The things we talked about with Joe and some of the liberties and license he took, they're very important and they're significant, and it's hard for the people, those of us who are journalists who also love Joe Mitchell, to square that circle. But if you're a journalism student or you care about journalism, forget all that. Read Rats, read Mr. Hunter, read even old Mr. Flood, who was a fictional person, but there's nothing fictional in there when Joe Mitchell describes how you drag for clams. That's all factual, that's all detail, that's all observation. It's unbelievable what he saw and what he remembered and what he committed to the page, and that is what every journalist and aspiring journalist can learn from, if nothing else.
Great. Well, you all have been very patient through this conversation, but I do want to give you a chance to ask some questions as well. Our microphone has drifted up front, so maybe if we put the stand back, those who wanted to ask a question could line up behind the mic, and we'll probably have time for about half a dozen or so. And then we have a reception that you'll want to enjoy.
While we're waiting, could I just ask, is Nora Sanborn in the hall? Oh, okay. Nora is Joe has 2 daughters, and Nora is the older daughter. I thought she might be here, but I hadn't seen her, so I just wanted to check. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Gosh, I'm first. Walker Evans came to the city. He was another great walker of the city. And he came to New York at almost exactly the same time, filled with ambitions to write like James Joyce. He turned to photography because he couldn't.
Right.
He's from the Midwest, not the South. And a lot of people don't realize that his most famous pictures, of course, are in the rural South, but he took thousands of pictures in New York. It's where he learned to be a photographer. And I just wonder whether did Joseph Mitchell know him, or Bernice Abbott, or any of the other straight photographers of that day? Or is there any conversation going on between him and the photographers?
He absolutely did know a lot of the photographers in the city. I can't say for sure if he knew Walker Evans, although I suspect he did. He knew Berenice Abbott. Actually, the photographer that he's sort of most associated with is Dion Arbus, who he never met. But they had a telephone relationship for about 20 years until she died. And she first, when she was a young photographer, she actually called Joe because she had been inspired by, his stories about these people on the margins, if you will. And she was just beginning to photograph these, and I think he was always very fond of her, but he was always, I think, a little concerned that she saw them somewhat as freaks. And to Gay's point earlier, he never did. He never condescended. I mean, one of the things he thought was most interesting about Lady Olga, the sideshow performer, the bearded lady, was just that the things that interested her and motivated her were the same sort of banal things that motivate and interest the rest of it. She really wanted to be a court stenographer.
I didn't know until now that I also had a relationship with Diane Arbus. I didn't know it until this very moment. We were going to work together on a book, and we had a prostitute that I insisted have a real name. And she was a prostitute that I saw with Afghan terriers. She was walking with these beautiful, beautiful gray dogs, greyhounds they were, enormous dogs, on Park Avenue between Lexington Park. And there she was every afternoon, and I was seeing Diane Arbus because I met her in 1960, but she was doing some work for Esquire. And I said, we have to do this. And we met the prostitute, dined her and wined her, hoped that we could get her to sign. I could use her name, but it never happened. But I certainly pleased to hear that Joe Mitchell and I had an affection for Diane Arbus, or an interest. Wow.
A real quick coda to that, you'll also discover in the book that, to your question, Joe's wife, Therese, was a very, very accomplished photographer. She didn't do it commercially, but she spent years walking the city, taking photographs very much in the same vein and the same kind of people that her husband was writing about, and that people like Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange were photographing during the Depression. And I have some samples in my book, but if you want to go online and just Google Therese Mitchell and photography, you'll see some examples, and they're spectacular.
I'm going to disappear in just a minute, but it occurs to me, just standing here, that Evans's early New York photographs don't really suggest any kind of conversation with Joseph Mitchell, but his later ones do. Mm. And I just wonder whether perhaps he was just reading, or perhaps they did know each other, and he influenced Evans to take these different kinds of pictures, which are more Arbus-like than the original ones.
Yeah, I don't remember seeing any real particular record, but I'd be shocked if they didn't.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Me too. Thank you.
I have two comments I want to make. Firstly, I can't resist. I spent roughly 50 years as an oral historian and directed the oral history office here at Columbia for 20 of those years. And your comments about tapes and tape recorders are somewhat bothersome because I spent 50 years with a tape recorder. But it does pose an interesting question, is the way in which an interview from the tape becomes either a reference or an article in and of itself. And it raises a question about who was the narrator, and who was the trusted narrator, and who was the not trusted narrator. That was the first comment. The second one is, when I was a young man, decades and decades and decades ago, I tried to write a short story. I tried to write fiction, and I couldn't. And thinking back on that now, the reason I couldn't, I think, is that I don't think metaphorically. That's why I became a historian. I don't have to think metaphorically. Because if someone says a wild goose chase, I want to know, what does a tame goose do? How many wild geese is a wild goose chase? What is the reality of that metaphor? I destroy stories as stories in order to get history. And it's kind of bothersome, but that's what I've done for 50 years. Thank you.
I would like to thank you, by the way, as somebody that spent a lot of time in your archives for several projects. What an incredible cultural patrimony that is.
We used to estimate that 2,000 books have been published out of that collection.
I'm not surprised. If you've never been in the oral history collection at Columbia University, you should.
And I should say that's Ron Grayley, who did not identify himself. He's been a great friend to all of us for a long time.
One of my favorite characters, one of my favorite Joe Mitchell characters is Joe Gould. And Joe seemed to have a very tortured relationship with Joe Gould. And he wrote a long story initially, and then a secondary story that basically accused Joe of fraud in some respect. And I'm curious to know what you feel about the relationship between Joe Mitchell and Joe Gould. And there was some intimation in your book that Joe felt that he was, in some way, Joe Gould.
So can you just explain a little bit of context for everyone about Joe Gould?
Yeah. So one of the most famous stories that Joe Mitchell ever wrote, it actually was a two-step. In 1942, he wrote when he was writing more about these New York characters, he wrote this about Joe Gould, who was a Greenwich Village vagrant and and had a lot of emotional problems, alcoholic, but brilliant. And he wrote a profile called Professor Seagull, which you'll have to read the book to understand. But he was interested in Joe Gould because Joe Gould was ostensibly writing something he called an oral history of our time on this theme that at the time was said to be 7 or 8 million words. And as when Joe wrote that profile, fairly he was already beginning to suspect that maybe the oral history didn't actually exist. He had seen snippets of it, but not whole chunks of it. 22 years later, Joe Gould's Secret was the last piece that Joe Mitchell ever published, and we referenced that earlier. And in there, he basically says that Joe Gould's secret was that the oral history did not exist. Now, an interesting coda to that is that about 2 months ago in the New Yorker, a New Yorker reporter who also teaches at Harvard wrote suggesting that she thinks maybe there was more of the oral history that existed than Joe Mitchell actually let on. I haven't seen some of the documents that she based that on, and I would like to, because I'm not, from what I've seen, I'm not persuaded that there was much of the oral history either. But to your point, Kathy, unquestionably, Joe Mitchell regarded Joe Gould as something of a doppelganger, or somebody, this is what I would be if the fates had cast things differently, if I had had mental illness, if I'd been an alcoholic, if I hadn't had love, if this or that happened. There were a lot of similarities between the two of them, and it's true. And then even after Joe Gould died, he effectively haunted Mitchell really the rest of his life. So it's an interesting, complicated relationship.
David?
Hi, my name is David Haydu. I teach in the journalism school. I admire your book. I know Gay. Good to see you. I admire you both. And I teach Mitchell, and I've taught him extensively every year for 10 years. And like Gay, I was shaken to find some of the revelations in your book. But I remembered also being shaken when I first read in the introduction to Up in the Old Hotel that he admitted there in the introduction that some of the pieces that had originally been published as fact were really fiction. My question for you is, do you think that during this, his fallow period, he had any misgivings or regrets about his employing the imagination, which he did, or his use of what you're calling composites, but in many cases were fabrications? Do you think he had any misgivings or regrets about it?
My sense, from what I've seen, from Norm's interviews, from the material, what's in some of his files and what's not in some of his files, I think probably retrospectively he may have regretted that they pushed the composite thing, a little too far, perhaps. And I don't know that it bothered him having done it. I think he was concerned that if, like, one of the reasons, he never acknowledged that the gypsy profile was a composite. And I think he feared that if this started coming out, it would tarnish his reputation, and maybe with reason. I do not have the sense that he ever really regretted Norm, the liberties that he took with consolidating conversations. He sort of regarded that as moving around the furniture in the apartment. It may look a little different, but it's still the same apartment. I mean, that was my sense, because he really that interested him much less than the overall story he wanted to tell and the emotional impact of the story. I do have a feeling, in part because he stopped doing it, that he maybe experimented too much with the composite. It's interesting, Gay had mentioned David Remnick in an earlier forum. We were on this subject, and David said, I don't know that it would be impossible for Joe to do those kind of stories today, but we would have to figure out how to do them and what to call them. I mean, in a way, if there was fraud involved, the fraud was that the New Yorker was labeling these as profiles or reporter at larges. I mean, the reader would have no reason to think that they weren't as factual as everything else that appeared as a profile, and this was done with the complicity, even the urging of the editor. And that's very puzzling. I mean, and I probably know as much about Harold Ross as anybody left alive, and I'm not sure why he did it.
Well, if you don't mind if I ask a follow-up, I'm a journalist, I can't help. You said, correct me if I'm misquoting you, that maybe he was fearful that if this got out, it might tarnish his reputation. Are you making a distinction between the values that he held and the values that he saw in the public at large? In other words, you're thinking that he was fine with it, but the fear was rooted only that other people might not like it? What distinction are you making?
I think he was always proud of what he wrote, even the pieces that, in retrospect, we think we look at differently. I think he was very, very proud of those stories. But he was a smart guy. I mean, and I think he felt like if all this was out there, then people would reasonably have questions. Well, did Lady Olga exist, and did Philippa Scott? I mean, some of these people, were evident, but just quite throw shadows on his entire oeuvre, if you will, and that would have bothered him tremendously.
All right, thanks.
And I think, in the context of journalism today, I think it's right to say that composite is a little soft. I mean, a composite is what Janet Cook created, and it's
Right.
it's a fabrication.
It's a fabrication.
Hi, my name is Vince DiGirolamo, and I just want to suggest that if we're looking at talking about who committed fraud, maybe James Joyce has committed a bit of a fraud, because when my wife flew off to Ireland, I stayed home. I said, well, I'll listen to James Joyce on tape, and I was struck by how much of a documentary novel that is, and how much you get the profiles of people who existed in his family. And it seems to me that the issue that I want to bring up is the idea of imagination. Is it something that these fiction writers have and these nonfiction writers do not have? Because what is the role of imagination in conceiving a story, in figuring out how you're going to bring your themes out, organizing, letting go, cutting? It just seems to me that imagination does play a role in the nonfiction work that we're doing.
That's a good question. I want to hear Gay on it in a minute. But let's just take one last question, and then we'll let everyone drink and buy books, as one should do every night.
Hi, I'm a student at the journalism school, and one of the things I wanted to ask was the time is a lot different nowadays, especially in the cultural landscape, and just the way people react to journalists when they go into interviews. So I was wondering, are the sort of characters that Joseph Mitchell wrote about, do you think either they still exist, like those sort of eccentrics and those sort of, I guess, people, and B, do you think if they do exist, are people willing to open up like Joseph Mitchell could get them to?
They exist. They're people. People are people, and one of the genius aspects of Joe Mitchell is he found them, and then he had the patience and the wit to know how to. And when Gay was talking about talking to Floyd Patterson, I mean that he was talking. I mean that's the sort of thing Joe Mitchell did. He talked to people and talked to people and would sit down with them repeatedly until they were comfortable enough to start opening up. The missing element, and we still have talented journalists. I mean, maybe more than ever. The missing element is time. That's what we've lost, or the willingness of the individuals to spend the time, or more often the willingness of the people they work for to give them the time. And then, I mean, the great thing about the internet is if you find Lady Olga out there and somehow you've got the time, and there are wonderful documentary makers and. Those sorts of things are still happening, but they're not going to get 30 pages in the New Yorker or anywhere else.